We are all privileged to work in this very special place. The sound that your footfall makes as you cross the grand lobby in the NCOP wing, the musty fragrance and dim lighting of the old assembly chamber, the magnificent view and natural splendor of the mountain as you make your way to the Good Hope chamber, and the excited hustle and bustle in this house before the start of a sitting. It is a deeply significant place for our country. Here the cruelest laws of the apartheid regime were enacted. Here the most vicious nationalism held court and kept our country hostage from democracy for so long. But it is also a place where good triumphed over evil, where the brutal system of apartheid capitulated and its laws were dismantled. It's also where our Constitution was birthed, ushering in a new era of constitutional sovereignty and a Bill of Rights that sought to prevent the abuse of power by the executive. Parliament was restored to its rightful place as the heartbeat of our new democratic model of accountability and oversight. But this Parliament has to be far more than just bricks and mortar. And thus it's right, as we celebrate 20 years of the passing of our Constitution, to reflect on whether this House is living up to its mandate of those who framed the Constitution and who bequeathed to us the enormous responsibility set out in Chapter 4 and 5 of the Constitution. Perhaps most relevant for the discussion today is contained in Section 55, detailing the powers of the National Assembly, which tasks us with providing mechanisms to ensure that all executive organs of state in the national sphere of government are accountable to it and maintain oversight of the national executive and the exercise of national executive authority. And so the question we should be asking ourselves and framing in this debate is whether these mechanisms are working, and if not, what can be done to fix the situation. The former United States President Lyndon Johnson, who used the United States Congress and Senate to pass the Civil Rights Act, famously said that, and I quote, "Power is where power goes," unquote. The truth is that too much power has been allowed to slip away from this House and towards the executive. On some days, it's actually difficult to determine who is accountable to who. And that's why Minister Mshlobo, for instance, felt nothing when his agency deployed a signal jammer in this House in some bizarre Orwellian attempt to somehow control the flow of thoughts, views, and opinions of members of this House and the media. It's why Minister Nhleko felt no shame whatsoever when he tried to hoodwink this House into believing that a swimming pool was some elaborate firefighting mechanism. It's why Minister Zwane felt impunity to arrive in this House barely a month ago to answer a question from a member of Parliament with a pre-approved Gupta script, no doubt hatched in the very bowels of the Saxon Wold Shebeen, and simply kept reciting the same hackneyed lines over and over and over like a stuck CD. It's why Minister Masuta can announce to the world that we're selling out our principles and leaving the ICC, and then only bother to inform this House as some afterthought. It's why Minister Nhleko can address a letter excoriating and demeaning this House and its presiding officers only because it simply wouldn't process his political vendetta against Robert McBride. And it's also why certain members of this House obsess themselves more about what the President's title in this House should be than his actual misdeeds. These are just a few of the many examples where the executive has shown complete contempt for this House. The tragedy is this House, like some battered spouse in an abusive relationship, just carries on regardless, continuously turning away from dealing with the problem or trying to explain it away with a myriad of excuses. And just like that type of relationship, a brokenness has settled into this Parliament. The emasculation and weakening of this House began a long time ago. Its key oversight role and undermining of it had its genesis in the now infamous arms deal, where the executive first started to dictate to this House how and when it would be held accountable, picking off one by one the bastions of accountability, Scopa, the House, and debate. This assault on the House has found its result in the unprecedented Constitutional Court judgments, and it will have its finale if we do not arrest this slide in complete irrelevance. For far too long, this Parliament has allowed the executive to get away with this behavior, and at every turn, the executive is cosseted and protected from having to face the full blast of proper accountability. And the Speaker needs to bear a great deal of responsibility for this brokenness. Our rules and procedures and conventions make it clear that the Speaker is the head of and representative of the legislative arm, and although affiliated to a political party, must perform the functions of that office fairly, impartially, and the interests, and this is the most important part, of the Assembly and Parliament. She is not responsible to executive government and must seek to preserve the House's independence from it. And so we have to ask ourselves why, at every single major test this House has faced since the Fifth Parliament began, has the Speaker continuously erred on the side of protecting the executive and taking their side over this Parliament. It's why the Nkanda debacle was allowed to drag on endlessly. It's why the SABC fiasco was allowed to escalate so prolifically. It's why ministers don't even bother to prepare to answer questions in this House properly, because they know full well that they will never, ever be compelled to actually provide a proper answer to this House. And the great irony to me is that the landmark Nkanda judgment focused so much on the omissions and actions of the President, but so little detail was paid to the damning indictments it listed as the failures of this House to deal properly with oversight and accountability. We need to arrest this slide, and we need to do it now. Thank you.
Deputy Chief Whip of Majority Party.